Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast and part 2 in this series.
As days go by, obviously the news, TV news picks up on this. The newspapers are covering this pretty heavily. And we get a lot of reports of people who thought they saw Mark that day. Two young boys, 8 and 10 years old, swear they saw Mark at the roadblock. If you're familiar with that area, there's a section between Middle Township and Lower Township, and it's a fragmity grass. It's just a highway, and there's nothing else, and the creek is in there too. So the roadblock really consisted of that area. And on the south end of that roadblock is Lower Township. Two boys who approached the fire from that end say they saw Mark around 4 o'clock that day, standing with a man. And at one point, the man has Mark by the hand, and he grasps him firmly, and they turn and walk east down Miami Avenue, which is a residential street, off into the, out of sight. But they know Mark from the neighborhood and swear that they saw him around 4 o'clock with a man, and they gave a description, and there is a sketch of a man based on that. Detectives, I didn't speak to these kids, but detectives told me that some of the details of their story changed the different days that they were interviewed. So they don't take that as credible as the other information we have on Mark's location.
2 follow-up questions on that. The distance between the Cape May County Park entrance that Mark was seen going into by the guard and the area where these kids think that they may have seen him, would it have been possible for him to have traveled on foot in that time frame from the park entrance to the other location?
There's a possibility that Mark could have he on foot. He physically could have walked that distance. The time to match the time frames, that is a question. This is on the road. This is where there's fire police at both ends. So if Mark you couldn't walk a direct line from the Lower Township side of the roadblock to the Middle Township side of the roadblock. That was reserved for fire trucks and it was blocked off. So for Mark to get to that point on the lower side, he would have come from the beach, which at one point he was, and continued east to Bayshore Road and be seen by those kids. Now, the Hilligans, as I told you earlier, they saw Mark. They're credible witnesses. They saw Mark around 3:30 walking back on the beach, back in the direction of his house. So that conflicts with the boys' location and time. Now, if Mark was abducted in that time frame and the abductors had driven around to the Lower Township side, that some kind of combination to that effect is possible. But why they would do that, if they've taken possession of them and now they're on the opposite end of the fire and then re-expose themselves, and giving Mark another chance to yell for help or something, that is not too logical, but physically that's how Mark would have had to have ended up around 4 o'clock on the lower side is by vehicle. When he returns himself from the fire on the middle side, that someone by vehicle drives around and is now on the lower side.
How sure was the park guard that it was Mark that he saw entering the Cape May County Park at 3:45? Did the park guard know him? Was he familiar with him?
Yes, he was 100%. He knows Mark.
Okay. And was that an area that Mark went and hung out?
A lot. Okay. A lot. To the point where it was almost adversarial, where Mark and his friends would do criminal mischief to the bathrooms, and the guard would have to get county services to repair things in the bathroom, the stalls, and minor graffiti and things like that. he knew Mark very well and knew him as what's the word I'm looking, mischievous.
Did the park have any type of surveillance at that time?
They did not, and surprisingly, to this day, they do not. I don't know why. It's a very remote area.
In the course of the investigation, did any locations have surveillance? There was never any surveillance of Mark picked up?
No, and 1991, as you know, advanced businesses had surveillance. It wasn't like today where almost every home has some version of home video. Businesses who had the financing to do it had video security in banks, but in Delhaven, nobody had video surveillance. And in fact, there was a plea at one point, the first week of the disappearance, for anyone with VHS video of the fire scene. And to my knowledge, nobody came forward with anything like that.
Where was Mark's brother Matt that day?
As I said, he was musically talented, and there was play practice at the Middle Township Middle School where he went, and he stayed after school and went to, I believe it was play tryouts. And then what kids do is they catch the late bus home. So that bus it goes to the general area of Delhaven and drops Matthew off on the east side of Bayshore Road in that neighborhood. And he lives on the west side of Bayshore Road to the southernmost end of Delhaven. So he was, I would say, about a mile from his house where he was dropped off. And he didn't go right home. He went to a friend's house and was hanging out after school.
So to just summarize the timeline of the day that Mark went missing, he gets home from school. He heads over to this brush fire, goes back home, sees his mom who's leaving to take a neighbor on an errand, tells mom, I'm going back to the brush fire, presumably does in fact go back to the brush fire. The family that you describe sees him interacting with a white male in a vehicle, and then the park guard about 15 minutes later sees him entering the park with a 10-year-old girl, and then there's the question as to whether or not about 15 minutes after that he is seen again by these teens. Is that an accurate summary of the timeline?
It very much is so. And one thing I did mention is before he goes to see the fire, just to describe his physical capability, his dad had a radio tower off the back of the house. Mark climbed the tower and got up on the roof to look at the smoke, climbed back down, and that's when he approached his mom to go check out the fire. So he was a very physically capable boy, and he knew Delhaven. He knew the water hazards. Him and his brother and his friends had forts in the area, on the dunes, in the woods. So Mark knew the area very well, and he was physically capable where he climbed the radio tower. One other thing about Mark's physical description, a month before all of this, Mark would climb a tree and jumped out of the tree and fractured his left foot. And for several weeks, he wore a boot cast. And then the week of his disappearance, he was back wearing sneakers, but he actually wore hand-me-downs from his older brother, which were half a size larger, for the comfort of his foot that was recovering from the fracture.
And that's going to be important in a few minutes.
Correct.
He at some point mom comes home, he's not there. When does she get worried and contact the police?
In her description to the first detectives, officers on the scene, she was making fried chicken and potatoes and had started dinner and was waiting for Mark to come home. Now, The roadblock was 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. And Maureen was back at her house by 4:15, 4:30. She starts dinner. So people are the area's starting to dissipate from traffic, and things are starting to slowly calm down. Mom starts dinner, 5 o'clock. There's no sign of them. In between 4:15 and 5, she calls Matt at his friend's house, asks if he's seen Mark. He says no. And she says, I'm going to come get you, picks him up. Maureen had, right before that, had driven around the neighborhood to a few friends' house that she knew of Mark's, couldn't find him, picks Matthew up, and now they're going through a checklist of people they know or could call and can't find Mark. And Maureen, the panic of Mark being missing, drowned, abducted, whatever, starts to set in with her. She's very close with, she has 3 sisters and one lives in Illinois. And she calls her to ask what she should do. She's hesitant to call the police, the last step. Probably the first step you should do, but she delays that until she talks to her sister. Sister's like, if you feel he's missing, call the police. And she hangs up with her, and then I believe we received the call, let me see, at 5:58 p.m., Maureen saying that she can't find Mark. We have patrol zones. That patrol car was tied up on a shoplifting call, so the patrol sergeant, Skip Peak, a veteran officer, a hunter, a tracker, a SWAT team leader, a very skilled, knowledgeable guy, the right person to be on that call, really by coincidence, is the first one. He checks the neighborhood approaching Maureen's house before going right there to see if he can catch Mark walking, running away, and doesn't see him, goes to the house. They go through the checklist of things to do at the house, check under the beds, check in the bathroom, the crawl space, the neighbors. And then the sergeant, he begins his triage, if you will, checklist of things to do, calling for help for searchers and notifying administrators up to the chief of police and for a detective to come out.
You mentioned in the beginning that it was a cool day. What was the temperature like, and did Maureen, his mom, remember how he was dressed and what he was wearing?
She remembers very vividly. In fact, Mark had just received a new pair of Reeboks from his grandparents who visited from Ohio. That would be Mark's father's parents. And they bought him a pair of Reeboks, and they were his good shoes. He wore them to school. He changed out of them into your play clothes, if you will. And he had on a pair of gray Dockers. He had a dark blue navy sweatshirt, and I believe he had a jacket on as well. But the navy sweatshirt, which said U.S. Navy on the front of it, very distinctive. And he had his play sneakers, which had his very distinctive interlaced red and white lacing on both of them, which is the way Mark laced his sneakers. And then they were LA Gear sneakers that were hand-me-downs from his brother. Back to the temperature, it was a bitter cold day, and Mark was dressed to play outside in that, not survival 5 days in the raw temperature survival, but to play outside, he was dressed appropriate.
Just going back for a minute to the park guard in the park. The park has more than one entrance, right? Were there any other park guards on duty, and or did the park guard that was interviewed indicate whether or not anybody else had gone in or exited the park in the relevant time period?
There's only one drivable access to the park. That's the main entrance to the park. There is a single-person gate further to the right, and that's usually, I believe that's usually locked. They like to have everyone come in and out of the same place. But the guard did say, as a result of the roadblock, a lot of people were using the entrance to make U-turns in there as well. So there were not a lot of people in the park per se, but there were a lot using the driveway apron to make U-turns during the course of the fire.
Okay, so but nothing really came of it in terms of any other kind of unknown vehicles that may have entered or exited.
No, in fact, I believe the answer to the question, other people, no, there were no other people in the park to use the park.
Okay. And no other friends of Mark's heard from him or saw him that day, correct?
No.
Okay.
No.
So he's abducted, presumably on November 25th, 1991. And as you've described, the search for him begins. What transpires in the days, months, and then sadly the years that followed?
Right. Well, to start with, that night, Skip Peak called in every possible volunteer he can get a hold of, as well as the Coast Guard helicopter. So that night, and I was tracking times and darkness and things like that, and by 5 o'clock in November, of that part of November, you're looking at darkness. So 5:30, it's pitch dark. So Sergeant Peak is now dealing with a search in darkness, and he takes 3 fire trucks and triangulates them with their overhead emergency lights so that the Coast Guard helicopter had a search area. And while that's going on the ground, there's numerous. The Green Creek Fire Company is dispatched, and as many volunteers as they could get. And then they called for police officers coming off of the 4 to 12 shift, which usually is like 11:30 p.m., to come out after their shift and search, which North Wildwood sent a lot of people. There were 50 to 100 people that night were searching, including the Cape County Sheriff's Department K-9 unit. They focused on Mark's path to the south and the fire for a substantial period of time, and they track him going to the fire and back, but nothing else. A section of the group goes to the north of Mark's house on the beach, and about 75 yards from his house, they find his LA Gear left shoe. Leading up to the sneaker are 2 sneaker prints. After the sneaker print, there is 1 barefoot print and 1 sneaker print that go on for a distance, and then they go off into the soft, indiscernible sand. The K-9 unit is brought to that area. They take a scent article. They track Mark from that point north to the next paved road, which is Roosevelt Boulevard, and the scent stops immediately there, as if Mark took that route, he got into a vehicle at some point.
Can you describe again for me exactly where his sneaker was found?
Yes. The three streets that Mark's neighborhood, there's Rutledge, Sunray, and Eldridge. They run into Delaware Avenue and a dead end at Delaware Avenue and Delaware Bay. And to the left is the water tower in Lower Township and the fire, and to the right of his neighborhood would be where the sneaker was found, and that's like to the north. So it's about 75 yards from his house, north on the beach, which is at high tide is a relatively narrow path. They found Mark's sneaker. At this point, Meg, 1991, Middle Township has not had child abductions. I don't think we've had any since then. Mark's case was something unheard of, and we were not treating it. There was no Amber Alert. There was, Megan's Law wasn't in effect. That was a few years later. So we were not prepared for a child abduction case, and we weren't looking for that. We were looking for a lost or runaway 11-year-old boy that may have drowned or got caught in a water hazard, and that's what we were searching for. He was on a few medications to calm his anxiety down, and they searchers felt that they may be life-threatening medications if he doesn't take them right away. So there was urgency to get out and find Mark, and that's really all they were thinking about. Nobody was thinking about abduction. They pick up the sneaker, bring it back to Mark's house. No photographs were taken. It's not handled with latex gloves, not handled as evidence.
Was the sneaker ever tested for DNA?
It was multiple times. It was still sent to the lab eventually, but during the week of the searches, I can remember Walt Oliver being interviewed by a TV crew, and he picks the sneaker up and pours sand out of it, with his bare hands. So there's a lot of cross contamination. If there was any DNA from a bad guy on there, our chances were very slim at this point of trying to find anything. But nonetheless, that sneaker repeatedly has been sent to the FBI labs and to try and get something off of it.
And there's never been any doubt that it's his sneaker, correct?
Correct.
The location where the sneaker was found, where is that location in comparison to the location where I guess it was teens believe they may have saw him around 4 o'clock?
Well, you asked me distances before, and I said we had more or less a triangulation of the pump house, the park, and Mark's house. Now, if you include his sneaker, that triangle opens up to really like a rectangle of time and distance. That sneaker is was about 75 yards from his house. It's about a half a mile from the county park. And it's like the opposite direction. Like the park is along Bayshore Road. It's, there's vehicles. It wouldn't be conducive to somebody going to the beach. If Mark didn't, hypothetically, Mark was not at the park, and a bad guy is trying to grab him at the park, and he's running up, that would be Eldridge Avenue, is that 3rd street there that leads to the beach. He doesn't run up that street and then run on the beach and then lose. That's implausible. If anything, Mark gets into a vehicle at the park, and they stop, or at the point on Eldridge Avenue, driving away from the park, maybe Mark gets a chance to maybe get away from the vehicle, or the bad guy takes Mark and he's going to molest him on the beach in that area, maybe, and Mark's sneaker falls off at that point.
You said in the beginning that the sneaker was about a half size larger than his normal sneaker because of the broken foot, right? So theoretically could have come off easily.
Mark played in those sneakers, and he went to school with them. Theoretically, you could say anything is possible. Where it was on the beach, and knowing that he is now missing, I think it would have been forced off, even if he's running, or kicked off in some way. I don't think that haphazardly fell off to try and answer your question.
Okay.
I understand what you're getting at, but I think that it still fit enough that it wouldn't have just fell off.
Okay. At what point in time were any suspects developed? How long did that take?
I know 1991 through 1992, looking at the investigation file, and it's really goes in a chronological phase. We looked at a lot of local leads, whether they were, one of the things they did is, we didn't have Megan's Law and a list of Megan's Law offenders, but New Jersey prisons sent a list of people convicted of sex assault, recently released in the South Jersey area. So we had a list, almost a Megan's Law type list, within the first week of the investigation. Other local leads were looked into, but one report was that Mark was seen at the movies that night. He was in the theater and he came out and he looked disoriented at the popcorn stand, and then went back in, and that lead, we took the information, but it was never confirmed.
Right.
It was never ruled out either.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned. There is more to come. And don't forget to subscribe anywhere you listen.